The origins of the KCR actually go back to 1898, when a concession was obtained by the British and China Corporation to build a railway between Kowloon and Canton, construction on the British section starting in 1906. Working conditions for the engineers and labourers were difficult, accommodation and workshops having to be built on site. Malaria and dysentery were rife, and the decomposed granite through which some of the tunnels passed required heavy timbering. Bricks were used in the construction of some of the bridges, these being manufactured locally and fired in specially built kilns. Opened on the 1st of October 1910, the 35-kilometre-long single-track railway cost the Hong Kong government £1.3 million. The inauguration ceremony starting in Tsim Sha Tsui and then moving up to the border at Lo Wu. Amongst the dignitaries at the event was the then Colonial Secretary, Sir Henry May, and Mr. Wei Han, General Manager of the Chinese Canton Railway. In those days, the border post was a simple affair, 2 mat sheds with guards and flagpoles. As completed in 1910, the KCR started in Tsim Sha Tsui, then went northwards to Ya Ma Tei, through the Beacon Hill Tunnel to Sha Tin, along the coast to Tai Po and Tai Po Market, then on to Fanling and the Chinese border, where it was to join up with the Canton Railway, which was also under construction. In 1912, a narrow-gauge branch line was constructed from Fanling to Chateau Coq, but this was unprofitable and was closed in 1928 due to competition from a newly opened motor road. The railway served the colony well through the 20s and 30s, and although there was prosperity in Hong Kong, little changed in the lifestyle of the new territories. Victoria on Hong Kong Island just before the war was undoubtedly one of the most spectacular cities in the world. The waterfront bustling with activity, rickshaws keenly touting for business. The tenement areas alive with energetic children. Even the architecture of the central business district was considered amongst the foremost in the region. The tram ride up to the peak was inspirational, to say the least. And the vista as impressive as always. But all was not well. The war, which had thus far remained in Europe, was soon to engulf the colony. On the 8th of December 1941, the same day Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Japanese attacked. After some fierce fighting, the defenders were forced to surrender 2 weeks later on Christmas Day. Many Allied prisoners were taken, and the territory fell into decline. The occupation was to last for 3 years, 8 months, and during this time trade virtually disappeared. Currency lost its value, and the KCR under the Japanese could only muster a very limited service. In the post-war years, much of the population who had fled to China during the occupation returned to the territory, and things began to pick up. In the late 40s, as the nationalist government faced defeat at the hands of the communists across the border, the territory received an additional influx of people unparalleled in its history. Hundreds of thousands of people entered the colony during the early 50s, swelling the population to over 2.5 million. At the time, Kowloon Station in Tsim Sha Tsui not only served as a busy gateway for the new territories in Kowloon, but because of its close proximity to the ferries, for Hong Kong Island as well. The railway was also the most convenient link with the north, as the road system through the new territories was not well developed at the time. On average, the KCR carried around 15,000 passengers a day, with gross earnings of some $7 million annually, $2 million coming from its freight service. Like many railways around the world at the time, the KCR's efficient and cost-effective steam locomotives were still the mainstay for hauling passengers and freight. A locomotive pulling out of Kowloon Station under full power was a majestic sight and epitomized the romance of train travel. For until 1949, it had been possible to travel from Hong Kong to Europe by train using the Trans-Siberian Railway. All in all, the KCR's association with steam lasted 50 years. But by 1962, diesel locomotives had replaced steam entirely. Hong Kong was fully industrialized, with the immigration from China continuing. Although the government was forced to try and curtail this great influx of people, most measures just seemed to strengthen the resolve of the emigres to make it to the territory. In the early 70s, under the then governor, Sir Murray MacLehose, one of the largest resettlement and housing programs in the world began. This called for massive infrastructural development of the new territories, including the building of public and private housing estates. Also incorporated in the plan was the modernization of the KCR. At this stage, the railway was carrying 14 million passengers and hauling 1.5 million tons of freight annually. Gross railway receipts were some $30 million and expenses $22 million. With passenger patronage already on the rise, the railway could never possibly cope with the projected figures that would result from the development taking place in the new territories. A major limiting factor was the single-track line, which could only handle 24 passenger trains per 18-hour day. So by the late 70s, a $3.5 billion redevelopment program for the railway was implemented. Included in this was double-tracking the entire line up to the border, demolishing and rebuilding existing stations, adding new ones, and electrification. Apart from the rebuilding program, there was also the decision taken in 1982 to change the status of the KCR from a government department to a public statutory body.